Welcome everyone. I'm going to go ahead and post the guidance from AAG in the chat about having an environment free of harassment, which I'm sure we wouldn't have anyways, but it's just nice to share that. My name is Heather Beatty, and I'm an associate professor of environmental studies at Dickinson College. And we have a wonderful group with us here today. I co-organized this panel with Tom Patak, who's at Texas State. We have Julia Haggerty at Montana State, and then we have Andrew Curley from University of Arizona here today. So what I'm going to do is do a little bit of a brief overview of the session, and then we're each going to have about 10 minutes to talk about a specific form of energy pedagogy, and then we're going to have a couple minutes to respond to each other as panelists, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions as we're going or want more resources, feel free to pop those in the chat, and then hopefully we'll have time to go through everything. So as you all saw in our overview for this session, we're really kind of making the statement that we as geographers have a unique position to train students about the multifaceted nature of energy systems, including production, extraction, transmission, distribution, consumption, and emissions. This is really kind of at the forefront of a lot of people's minds right now as we think about the energy transition and how much there's still dependency on fossil fuels. I think with the current conflict right now, that's really coming to mind with natural gas. Our burgeoning subdiscipline of energy geography offers numerous pathways for students to engage both theoretically and practically with these issues across different scales. And I think each of us in our own research, but also in our teaching, we sort of end up bridging some of those issues in terms of looking internationally, looking domestically. Personally, my research is centered predominantly on India, but I do a lot of my teaching on Pennsylvania and kind of United States-based energy issues, just because it's easier and kind of more relevant for people to engage with, particularly during the pandemic. Careful and thoughtful pedagogy is really critical for encouraging practitioners to promote salient, cutting edge, and inclusive research. This, we hope, will make our field more engaged and inclusive for all, including those historically excluded from information and decision-making processes associated with energy possibilities and futures. And we really see these issues are still at the forefront. Like, I had a former student that's actually been in touch with Andrew, in touch with me yesterday about a recent BLM meeting where on the Navajo Nation, there was no information shared about, no real information shared with the community about what fracking would look like and what that would move forward. She said the words natural gas and fracking were never even mentioned in the meeting. They were talking more about electricity production and kind of the opportunities for the community. So I think these are not things that are no longer relevant. They're relevant in our everyday all the time. Key components of making energy geography more inclusive through pedagogy include diversity, so active engagement in thought materials, and really seeing this not as a static process, but as something we all have to actively keep on re-engaging with. Being flexible, so there's really distinct needs for the range of students that we are all teaching, dependent on our institutions, but also what their particular backgrounds and familiarities are. Equity, so opportunities to provide all students to thrive with pedagogy that works for their particular needs, but also collaboration. So I'm going to speak later on specifically about working with community partners on some of these issues, but there's other ways, I think, without doing direct collaboration that you can really center voices across various ways. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Tom Patak, who is going to speak with us about using energy and climate simulations as a strategy for problem-based learning. And Tom's going to speak roughly for 10 minutes, and then we'll pass it over to Julia after that.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So one of the, I guess, the key challenges that I've found with a lot of students, if they're not, taking a specific degree, minor or major in energy, this is actually commonly, if they take a class with me, their first engagement with a lot of these issues and concepts. So what I, have been playing around with is trying to take things that are sort of unfamiliar and in many ways theoretical, and placing students right in the middle of some of these really complex decisions that we know many of us are forced to make when we are working with energy. So I've got a couple of different strategies. One I use commonly is it's a class session long simulation. Also, and for example, I might split the class into 5 separate groups. Each group will adopt the role of advocating or be an industry group that needs to advocate for the development of a particular technology. And they go off and they do a bit of research, and we have a town hall meeting. So we have, the oil and gas lobby, the wind lobby, the nuclear lobby, the hydropower lobby, and maybe something, like the energy efficiency council. We all get back in the classroom and we have a town hall, and each group gets to present their sort of statement as to why they feel this technology is a technology that should be adopted or developed. And then after their statement, they are forced sort of on the fly to respond to questions from the other groups, who are obviously sort of looking for vulnerabilities in their statement and looking to sort of undermine their position. So this is a great process for a lot of the students who are forced to sort of think and act and make decisions on their feet about sort of complex problems around technology and policy. And it also gives them the opportunity to sort of understand more about the you can't get something for nothing nature of energy systems. There are always going to be sort of payoffs and benefits and vulnerabilities. So that's just one sort of a strategy that I've used, and I've found this being really, really effective. And the feedback in the evaluations is commonly that the active learning that they undertake for the simulations is really, really effective. So that's just a single class session, although we do research prior and we do a sort of reflective exercise after. But what I also want to spend the most time talking about is a term-long simulation that I do with my students. It's developed by a professor at BYU, Idaho, and I want to take you through just some of the core components of this simulation. Again, we split the students into groups, and they will adopt this sort of persona of a theoretical country. Okay, so they're a country. They need to, over a series of sort of rounds, manage a country scale energy system. They have a number of goals or a number of challenges. They need to sort of maintain a high standard of living, okay, for their resident population. They need to reduce negative impacts on the environment, which means reducing emissions round by round. They need to maintain a stable government. So they need to have public approval. They need to operate within a budget. They need to also provide a stable energy supply. And they also need to improve their country's long-term energy security. So what I want to do here is just share my screen with everyone to show you and just take you through what this actually sort of looks and feels like for many of the students, okay? So here we have the simulation. 6 rounds. We have the theoretical country. This country is named Pakistan. And each round, the students will have to meet a series of short-term goals and long-term goals. So I'm going to draw your attention here to the short-term goals. We've got 3 ticks next to the short-term goals. In order to sort of meet these short-term goals, they play around with power plants. They can add or remove nuclear power plants, fossil fuel power plants, and renewable power plants, which will all link into their short-term goals. So short-term goal number 1, supply has to meet demand, okay? Because we all know with a power system, a large-scale power system, if we have a mismatch there, we're going to have disturbances to the grid like we had here in Texas just over a year ago. We have to have a budget that's in the black, not in the red for this, for the short-term goals to be met. You have to be meeting your budget, and you have to maintain higher than 45% approval, okay? So for example, here we can see this is all based on the power plants. If we take 5 nuclear plants away, it's going to seriously impact your energy system. So we'll put them back, okay? So on a round-to-round basis, the students need to always be meeting these short-term goals, okay? Each round represents approximately 10 years of time, and we'll see that this is sort of, the metric here is oil consumption, which is going down every 10 years because we're moving away from a reliance on oil. So on a sort of round-to-round basis, you have to meet your short-term goals. But the real crux of the simulation is round by round, continually reducing your emissions, improving your energy security, and improving your profit scores. The way that the students will do, meet these longer term goals is by working what we call here action points, okay? You can choose 5 specific technologies for each round. And we can see here for this particular round, Pakistan has chosen farmers market, uranium, safe nuclear, carbon tax, and reforestation, okay? In order for the students to choose those technologies, and we have a list of about 120 different technologies that students can choose from. In order for students to actually be able to use a technology in the simulation, they have to write research papers about them, okay? We've got a guide here. It's about 120 slides long, going through all of the respective technologies. This is a carbon dioxide scrubber. It'll tell the students all of the sort of points, what they'll earn, and a sort of overview of the particular technology. We've actually got a list of all of the specific technologies and a couple of the resources that they might be able to use, some references to find out more about them. So on a round by round basis, they're meeting their short-term goals through power plants. They're really trying to strategize about long-term goals, reducing emissions, increasing security, and improving profit through these action points and by writing these research papers. They get 20 action points for each round, and then they can choose between how these action points might influence their particular energy system. So we can see the nuclear lobby here will lobby for nuclear power plants, and this will increase the public approval of nuclear power, okay? So if they invest in nuclear, but it brings their approval score down, they might be able to sort of manipulate the system here by going to the nuclear lobby and improving their approval scores here. The same could be said for fossil, renewable energy lobby, and all of these different types of small manipulations of the system here. So we do this over the entire semester. It starts out with students frantically trying to understand the system and get their head around all of the inputs and vulnerabilities. And what I tend to do is induce a state of anxiety about the simulation for the students, okay? That is the pedagogical approach where they will then spend time to try to sort of understand all of the complexities that will, combine to running these gigantic energy systems, and all of the stakeholders, the underlying economic impacts, the policy impacts, the sort of physical impacts of supply and demand, and all of the ways that we might be able to sort of manipulate how this system works, or how the system is perceived or engaged with by public figures and private figures. So we go through these 5 rounds. We have a scoring system here that we can see how each particular group does on a round by round basis. We also have the list of the technologies on the spreadsheet that will show how it affects different parts of the systems. So I've found this semester-long simulation to be a really, really powerful tool for students to sort of engage with energy in a way, and sort of to have themselves embedded in these really complex decision-making processes that generate a learning outcome and a sort of active learning mode of pedagogy around these really complex issues. So that's what I've got for this morning. Thank you all.
Thanks, Tom. That's amazing to see the extent of resources there, but also I love the research paper component that if they want to use something, they have to actually do research on it first. There's already questions coming up, but I've asked folks if we can hold them till the end, but I'll invite Tom to have a look in the chat to kind of answer that later on. Next, we're going to pass it on to Julia Haggerty, who's going to speak on shifting baselines, accommodating the rapid evolution of energy systems and knowledge in the classroom. And your dog is much better behaved than mine, Julia, just sitting there nicely.
Well, as soon as I have something to do, she'll bark at the mailman. So I apologize if that happens. I'll go on mute. So Tom, that was so cool and just so impressive, and looks like so much work must have gone into that. It's really amazing. What I thought I would do is just, I'm going to borrow Tom's system analogy and just say, like, I wanted to reflect a little bit on what it's been like to be teaching energy geography for about a decade now. And I would say that there's a situation for me as a teacher where the demand from students is outstripping supply. And so I'm going to frame my comments in terms of that, of sort of trying to address a really changing demand base that I've experienced. So I'm in a land grant institution in a red state, and we have a very small geography program, a growing interdisciplinary environmental studies program, a growing sustainability minor. Those have largely grown through adjunct faculty and in a very haphazard way, without offering, for example, a clear set of courses in even climate studies or energy studies or anything like that. So the course that I teach, Energy Resource Geography at the 300 level, I've been teaching since 2013. And like as with Tom, it is often one of the only classes that students encounter where there's a direct engagement with energy systems, particularly social, political, economic dimensions of energy systems. So it's a tough mandate in the sense of what is it that we really need to be accomplishing in this classroom. And I'll just note for context that in the last couple of years, as I have more administrative responsibilities, one of those has been chairing the Campus Sustainability Council, and that's our campus-wide group entrusted with working on sustainability issues for how campus operates. So things like a campus sustainability plan, how we compost, and what our climate action work is. So a couple of things I wanted to just organize some comments around what's changed in this last 10 years and what seems to be staying the same in terms of my teaching commitments. So as Heather said at the beginning, the student appetite for thinking about an energy transition is really dramatically increases every year. And so does their appreciation and frustration with sort of climate politics in general. And of course, as I've been teaching the last 10 years, the whole political context of energy systems, much of it continues to change and changes on a regular basis. So you get up to speed with the Paris Accords, and then the Paris Accords fall apart. And so you are constantly negotiating that. And then as well at a local and state scale, the energy kind of politics and energy action are also changing a lot very quickly. And I would say a really important thing that sets the context for where I am now is just the idea that we have this very profound political divide and inability to communicate across different perspectives. And I think that's important to address in our students that are going out in the world and interested, whether they're interested in energy technology or in climate issues. Another thing that has really changed is the availability of textbooks. When I started in 2013, I was using some weird engineering textbook plus a bunch of added stuff. And now I have the Bridge et al. Textbook, which has just changed my life and has been so wonderful. And I would say one, as I have emerged as a teacher, another thing that has really changed is my understanding of kind of what students need. So, and what I can model. So when I started, I might've thought like good knowledge and critical thinking skills are a way that we can have societal change, because students will go out with this knowledge and their critical thinking and they'll go do good things. And I think as a feature of my lived experience, and then also kind of where we are in the world, I also have really come to appreciate the need for interpersonal skills, mutual understanding, kindness, empathy, and I see energy systems as an interesting way to think about that. And Tom, certainly your continued use of multiple stakeholder kind of perspectives, I think is important in thinking about that. What hasn't changed is that most students come with still, while they may come with more, I no longer have to worry about someone in the back of the room not believing in climate change, right? And they may come with much more climate literacy. There's this fundamental challenge of system illiteracy that is quite profound. And I even see in my own kids as they go through the public school system, they are learning a lot about the climate crisis. They are learning very little about energy systems. And so you have this constant challenge of a growing knowledge space and still this kind of basic system illiteracy that makes it hard to do in one course, kind of all of those things. And then also, I don't know what it's like at your universities, but we don't really have a lot of new courses and we don't have a lot of new faculty, and our university has grown really quickly. So we are just really struggling with our workloads to kind of be effective. So two things that I'm doing that kind of meet this changing context, I'll just say in my 300 level course, that I've really become interested in kind of a competency-based approach. So I use the Bridge et al. Textbook and we go through the nice conceptual theoretical problems in kind of social dimensions of energy systems. But I have 4 major kind of homework assignments that I call competency assignments. And that's about all the things that, Tom is getting at. Where do you find data? How do you understand, as you're procuring data, the larger politics of where that data come from? So for example, I use the basic exercise of, how to understand your electricity bill, not just as an exercise in kind of, how is energy distributed, but going from your energy bill to ask who are the major shareholders in our public utility, and what can you learn in this homework about those major shareholders and where their money comes from, so that you get this political kind of economic context as well. And I'm happy to talk more about those assignments. The other kind of piece I just wanted to mention is that I do more and more directed independent studies for those students that are looking for more. And one that was particularly meaningful last year is we did we called it a group independent study, where we took 8 students that are very active in the Sustainability Council, and we did a directed independent study for the semester with a colleague of mine, where they undertook a very robust research project in order to study how campuses can do climate action planning in effective ways. And this was about preparing this group of stakeholders to be effective in an upcoming climate action planning process on campus. So we had 8 students. My goal was really to make them effective advocates while also teaching them some of the basic skills of policy research. So They went through a very elaborate process at determining what peer institutions might be by collecting about 25 variables for 25 different universities, everything from the political climate of the state to the weather climate, all sorts of variables. I'm very interested in getting them thinking about campus endowments as a way, again, to make students appreciate kind of the larger political economic context we're operating in. They conducted a literature review in the scholarly literature about campus sustainability plans and do they work? And then they went out and interviewed stakeholders at the 8 or the 4 universities that they chose as peer comparisons. Then they evaluated their data, wrote a report, and were able ultimately to present it to our president, all in the notion of how can we prepare ourselves to do a good climate action plan? So rather than just diving in, let's take a semester to learn about how we can do this well. We're pretty proud of the report. It is a student report. I found a typo when I was pulling up the link, which I'll share with you here. Maybe you'll find it. In any case, that was a really rewarding process. We worked really closely. It was totally out of, the skin off my back. I did it at night as an added load. I won't get any credit for it, but it was really meaningful. And I think these kinds of projects are, in the situation I'm in, they're necessary to meet that growing demand and need, and eventually potentially can become new courses at the same time that we have to just keep moving forward with the basic energy literacy projects. So those are some things I'm doing. I'm happy to talk more about it.
Thanks, Julia. We've all been there with the student typos with community reports. So I can definitely empathize with that, but also your kind of late night and weekend engagement. I think that for all of us that are trying to do additional things above and beyond teaching, I think it takes a lot of time, and I think it's a challenge to balance that all for sure. And so one of my tips later on is going to be there's different moments in your career and your life to engage in these things and then to pull back a little bit as well. So next we have Andrew Curley. Andrew's going to speak to us about how we tell energy stories, communicating energy histories and questions to the public.
Good morning. Thank you, Yate. I'm Andrew Curley, and I'm an assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. And the classes that I teach that overlap with questions about energy and energy geographies are more broader or encompassing of environmental questions. So currently I'm teaching a class called The Politics of Nature and another one called Environment and Society, but you can tell already by the course titles that there's a lot of room through which you can talk about energy questions, energy issues. And of course I take advantage of that and I try to work on those things while I'm teaching. And in preparation for this panel, I was just thinking about what are some of the main points when teaching energy or talking about energy that I tend to emphasize. And one of the things that I focus on, given the nature of my research and my work has been ethnographic and working through the experiences of coal workers in the Navajo Nation. So I try to focus on energy as a social relation, like really to emphasize how it's a lived experience for many people. And getting out of the abstraction, which you can easily do with energy. In and of itself is already an abstract idea. And so, we can think about energy easily without thinking about people and how it interacts with people in both the production and consumption. And I think the earlier 2 presentations have articulated how we think about it more with people involved already. So like that seems to be an emphasis that we want to point out as geographers, as people who work on Earth, and environment, and people, as opposed to people in the geosciences or people in energy economics or economists who will abstract human relations out of the energy and which is itself a kind of violence, right? So that's the thing that we try to do. I think it's one of our charges as geographers is to really hone in on the social relations that are embedded within energy production, consumption, distribution. and so that's one of the things that I really focus on. It's like, who are the people who are affected and how are they affected differently? What does the landscape look like? How is it uneven, which it is uneven. So I don't have to pose that so much as a question, but to just to show that, you know, there are people who are paying more for it, both in terms of life and life lost, and also where they live being affected by it. So those are the things that I try to emphasize. The other thing with energy that I think is really important to think about is its history, and to historicize it. And in Arizona, you know, there's energy is not only energy, but the technologies that are currently used for energy access, you know, mining and extractive industries, you know, that's been a big part, a narrative of the state. You know, that's one of the major industries that was founded by settler colonialists when they came in here, was copper and copper mining. And it's the reason why the star on Arizona is brown, you know, is to emphasize the extractive minerals that come from the state. And so, you know, it's already embedded in the ideology of the state. And you go to the state seal, and it'll, you know, have a guy with a pickaxe, you know, leaning against it, you know, trying to unearth minerals and materials within underneath the ground, and using that as a form of development, modernization, and settlement, you know, colonization. It's this ideological foundation for the state. So I make the students, because we're also in a public institution, we're the land grant for Arizona. I try to get the students engaged directly with state institutions, to look on the state website to see how that ideology of extraction is embedded in the state practice today, not just as a past activity, but as a contemporary thing. And to try to link, you know, past colonialism, past ideas of colonialism with contemporary practices, to show that colonialism isn't only in the past, but it's perpetuated in everyday practice today, in everyday environmental governance. And so those are the things that we try to focus on and emphasize in class. So we go to the very technical, mundane websites, you know, on the state. We look at EIS statements. We look at just summaries of proposed projects that are being thought about throughout the state, and to see how there's a politics hidden, you know, buried within, you know, the technical language that you might encounter while you're looking on official documents, official websites. So it's to really link past and present. So that's so social relation is one, past and present is the second point I try to emphasize, and which brings me to the as somebody who works in indigenous geographies, to think about who are the people being impacted, and how what are the questions of political sovereignty for tribal nations, indigenous nations, whose lands on which energy is being developed, extracted, distributed, and consumed. And so those are the things that I don't want to just have indigenous itself become an abstraction, right? Oh, indigenous somewhere out there in our minds, and not have like very specific information of what that means. And so in Arizona, you know, we can actually look at 22 federally recognized tribes, and we can say, these are the nations around which the city is located, where Phoenix or Tucson is located. You know, these are the nations that have ongoing negotiations with the state government, with the county and city governments, and who have a federal recognition, which entails certain kinds of legal political rights. So and to be very specific of whose nations you're talking about. Like, are you talking about the Navajo Nation, Hopi, Tohono O'odham, some of the Apache nations around here? So you have to like really identify who you're talking about, and not to just say indigenous in this just general sense, but say, oh, San Carlos Apache is fighting the EPA on this designation of the forest as such. You know, to really emphasize the political sovereignty of tribes. And I think that's really important, because you can't do this disservice to tribes by just rendering them as indigenous without the real legal political rights which have been advocated and fought for over the last 50 years. And so you need to recognize who the tribal nations are, whose lands you're on, and how they're interacting with the state and with other governments on these questions. So to really think through the indigenous sovereignty question. And so when I'm assigning assignments or reading essays and getting students to think through an environmental problem, which inevitably is rooted in energy questions, if they're just kind of relying on this indigenous reference instead of saying, oh, San Carlos or the Navajo Nation or any of the other specific nations involved, that's where I intervene and say, no, you have to actually engage the tribal nation and you have to tell me what their perspective is, because they have it. They have a website, they have a government, they articulate their perspective, and you should be able to identify that. So those are the, that's the third point is I, as an Indigenous geographer and someone working in these areas, I really focus on tribal sovereignty and to know that the nations that are involved. Now, the other thing is you can't just leave it at that. You have to also know the historic lands that are dispossessed, right? Whose lands, when I say whose lands you're on, I'm also talking about traditional home bases. Many of the indigenous nations that are federally recognized had their lands violently dispossessed in the process of settlement, and have contested land claims. And many of these cities, many of the states, every community in the United States has some history of indigenous land dispossession in it. And so it's important to identify that and to bring that to the forefront and not to keep it buried in our understanding of these contemporary 21st century problems, right? To actually connect the fact that the questions of energy transition, the questions of energy production, whatever they may be at the moment, are building off of 19th century legacies of settler colonialism and racial dispossession, the racialization of indigenous peoples and dispossession of their lands in order to access these places. And so that's, these things are really important to tie history and ongoing activities with that. In my own work, I've also tried to emphasize that energy transition is not static. It's not something that's new either. It's something that's been ongoing, since energy has been a thing we've talked about, and it's shaped the relationship with the Navajo Nation, with the state of Arizona in the 1960s. The idea of moving away from dams to coal power was an energy transition, hydroelectric dams to coal-fired power plants. And it wasn't the exact rhetoric of such was not used, or the political discourse was a little bit different at the time, but it was by our own definitions today, what we would call an energy transition. So we need to look really historically at these questions, as well as to try to project into the future. And in fact, I think that history tells us more than the models that economists try to give us for predicting the future, because obviously those are things that don't exist. You're not actually showing something that exists in fact, but just trying to give you a sense of where things might go. Whereas history, those are things that actually happen, and then they can tell you, they can really expose dynamics that might be buried within our understanding of the social relations around energy. That, like I said at the beginning, I feel is a really important part of our task as energy geographers, to think about those questions. So those are the main things that I try to emphasize through teaching energy geographies. And if I have a little bit more time, I think I hope I made that as short as possible. But I just wanted to also share some maps that I use. And if anybody's ever seen me give a presentation, you probably will be tired of these maps because I share the same maps over and over again. I'm not a trained cartographer, or I don't do any map making myself. I just rely on other people for that. So for those reasons, I use I can't screen share. For those reasons, that's okay. I don't need to do it right now. I can do it maybe a question and answer. But that's but I'll just describe what the maps are. I usually, in the course of trying to show what indigenous nations are, I show a map of all the federally recognized tribes. Then I go to the Energy Information Agency and I get maps of where known coal reserves are, where known oil reserves are, and I try to overlay those maps with where the reservations are, and to show exactly how these where things are in proximity to tribal reservations create the kinds of tensions, the kinds of questions around energy production that is the basis of a lot of my own research, to give people the basis of why these questions are happening among tribal nations and indigenous peoples and communities. So with that, I'll conclude my comments, and then we can move forward from there.
And I just made you co-host, Andrew, so you can do that. Sorry, I didn't know you wanted to share those. But we'd love to see them in the Q&A. I think that sounds great. And I think, speaking to this audience, we all love maps. We're happy to see them multiple times. But I really appreciate how you're encouraging the students to think through the historical embeddedness of some of these contemporary processes, and they don't just sort of emerge out of nowhere. So. All right, so I'm going to be the last one to do a little bit of an overview here, and then I'm going to invite Tom and Andrew and Julia to respond to each other, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So I'm going to speak a little bit about engaged energy and geography through civic engagement. So there's three main ways that I like to think about this, but I'm going to put some caveats at the end as well, that I think when I first started teaching, I wanted to dive right in and do this right away. And I think it's something that you can build up to, but it's also not something that's appropriate at all levels of the curriculum, I think. I think it's better suited to upper level small classes. So the three things I'm going to talk about are listening to community partners. The second one is engage student learning through practical research skills. And then the third one is balancing theory with room for exploration, as this is such an emerging field, but also builds on a lot of history, as Andrew just noted. So what I really like to think about with listening to community partners is kind of challenging this idea of who has expertise, especially as someone coming in with a PhD, and how other people in the community end up treating me and wanting to call me doctor. And I said, no, please call me Heather. It's really an interesting thing to model for students, but also to kind of reinforce through my engagement with the public in public meetings or on boards that I serve on, to just kind of reimagine and reevaluate who has expertise. Because I think a lot of times when we're dealing with communities that are directly dealing with environmental injustices, whether they're energy related or not, they're really the ones that become experts on those particular issues rather than someone who has a fancy degree. So I really like to center these course projects around those needs that come up from anyone, regardless of expertise background. But I also really use those classes as an opportunity to challenge and kind of reinvent what we think of as practical, normal course assignments, because I don't think civic engagement works that well with some of our normal assignments. So the amount of reading that we would normally do in this semester and the kind of normal format for assignments, I've totally reimagined, which again, I think works differently at different points in your career in order to have that flexibility and that freedom. But I also try to set really clear expectations from partners. As Julia noted, when you're getting a student created report, even if I or my colleagues end up spending the whole weekend before it's due working on it, there's still going to be some mistakes. And so I always try to temper expectations and balance what our community partners are looking for with kind of what I think my students can do, but also what is feasible within the kind of portion of the semester. So the second major thing that I do is really try to kind of integrate practical research skills with engaged student learning. So Tom mentioned this right at the beginning, that this active learning approach is something that students really want, you know, as they grow more familiar with the energy transition and kind of wanting to see themselves as potential change makers. This kind of course provides the opportunity for them to see what that means in practice. But it also, I think, is a good opportunity for them to question some assumptions that they've made once they actually do research on something. So I think it's easy to say the answer is X or the answer is Y, but once you actually start digging into what that would mean for a particular community or what that looks like in practice, they can see it's much more complicated. So I think by actually having them work on some of these issues in practice, it really allows them to kind of struggle through some of those challenges, but also to be a bit innovative and think through, there's no perfect solution. So there's a lot of space for them to think through, well, how can they build off what's already there, but also be thinking outside of the box. So we understand and implement energy geography research methods. And I agree with Julia. I appreciate there's a lot more resources that are not quite as technical, because I had the same exact challenge as Julia, that like, you know, you do need some of those technical energy systems kind of overviews, but if you only use that, I think students really start to not focus and not understand everything that Tom and Julia and Andrew were emphasizing about the legal, historical, social, political, economic, cultural context for these energy processes. We learn and apply ethical research practices. So I have students go through the institutional review board process, but we also kind of go above and beyond that and kind of constantly check in to kind of think about the ethics of who we're working with, but also whether there's new vulnerabilities that come up. I'll be teaching a class like this in the fall. And I think right now with COVID, there's some additional vulnerabilities that we'll have to think through. We then actually craft a research question or questions depending on the needs of the community partner. This is something that students really struggle with, and we have to kind of work on quite a bit. I do have some good resources that we've used in the past, so if anyone wants any suggestions on that, I'm happy to receive suggestions as well. We design a research instrument dependent on what the need is of our community partner. So a couple of years ago, a community partner initially wanted us to do focus groups, but then decided that they were too bourgeois for their stakeholders. And so we had to adjust and adapt and just realize that people were showing up and thinking this was just not for them. And so again, that flexibility and that adaptability is something that I think is challenging for students because they want a lot of structure, but I think it's really good to work through it. Then we do field research, which again, in the fall, we will see how much of that is possible. We did it actually 2 springs ago when we were hybrid, half Zoom, half in person, and we made it work. It wasn't perfect. We then analyze the research findings. We collate the findings into a product. So in the past, we've done online GIS story maps, infographics, report. Again, it's dependent on what our community partner wants. And then we present that information back out to the public as a means to not keep the information in the kind of academic setting, but we really want to make sure it's accessible. So the third major way that I approach this is really balancing theory with room for exploration. So as Julia mentioned before, figuring out ways through really good textbooks and other resources that students can understand theory, but then understand in practice, what does that mean? So I want them, as I mentioned before, to realize that there's not perfect solutions, but also that there's space for them to be coming up with different ideas. So Jen Baca, who's on here, and I actually both together serve on the Pennsylvania Department for Environmental Protection's Environmental Justice Advisory Board, which is a mouthful. But in that setting, we both have served on there, I think, for about 2 years now. But I saw a really interesting opportunity come up for a community engaged project around the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that Pennsylvania is hoping to enter. It's still a little bit up in the air here, but if you're not familiar with this program, it's a Mid-Atlantic and Northeast states initiative. Not all the states are involved. In Virginia, their new governor is trying to pull them back out. Chris Christie pulled New Jersey out and they're back in now. But it's a program where carbon dioxide emissions from the power sector will be capped and reduced in Pennsylvania, and they can be sold to other places as well. So basically what was coming up as the Environmental Justice Board and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection was starting to think through some of these issues, people were aware that there was environmental injustices associated with this kind of energy cap and trade program, but they didn't know what they were, and they didn't know potential solutions or ways to kind of overcome those. So what my class ended up doing in the course of a semester was they actually framed research questions around a couple of different areas. So I broke them up into smaller groups, and they ended up creating this report, which I'm going to put in the chat a link to the report if anyone wants it, or if you don't get it, I'm happy to share it afterwards as well. So basically, sorry, I think I shared the wrong thing. This is what I wanted to share. So basically what my students were able to create in the course of the semester, sorry, give me just 1 minute here, make this full screen, was this report that really kind of pulled together this need to document past environmental and energy injustices from other programs, notably the California Cap and Trade Program, but also this idea of documenting through interviews Pennsylvania community air pollution concerns. So what is it that people in Pennsylvania are really concerned about? Because if this project goes through, all of the funding has to be used for air pollution related projects. So it's not as though it's a general fund for energy related initiatives, but they have to be aimed at reducing air pollution. And also another thing that the community partner wanted us to do was to really think through what are innovations in reducing air pollution through community engagement, but also what are good ways to communicate some of these resources to our broader community. So a big thing that we were able to hear from community partners is that people in Pennsylvania didn't understand what the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative was. So one thing that my students did throughout the semester was actually to create these infographics that you see here to synthesize and explain kind of what the project was in a really accessible manner. So again, not perfect when you have a student report, but it really became a good way for students to engage on these issues, but also to create something that ultimately they presented to the Pennsylvania Secretary General of the Department of Environmental Protection, and hopefully will help guide some of these initiatives as they move forward. A couple caveats, and then I'm going to throw it out to my fellow panelists here so folks can engage with one another's presentations. So I think this kind of civic engagement provides an opportunity to create a useful tool for a community partner that they wouldn't have access to. I think the student learning can be huge on this, but as Julia noted, it takes a lot of the professor's time, a lot of personal engagement. I have been really lucky that Dickinson has money from the Bellin Foundation, so not every time I teach these classes, but a lot of times I've taught them, I get a course buyout. So I'll teach one less course load that semester. And I would say it's not for all levels, as I mentioned earlier. I would never do this at our intro level because it's really too much, I think, to be learning some of the basic concepts and then trying to apply these ideas. So I teach it at the upper level, and there's prerequisites before students actually even get into the class, because we're sort of juggling a lot, as you could see there, with the community partners and the research methods and then applying them. And I think you need a certain level of engagement with students to be able to go out into the field and be engaging with our community partners. Yeah, so with those caveats, if anyone wants any of the resources, I've put the link to the report there, but I'm happy to share syllabi or other resources if it would be helpful. So I'm going to open it up to Tom and Julia and Andrew to kind of respond to what you heard from our fellow panelists, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after that. So if anyone is eager to go ahead and jump in there. Oh, Julia's still there.
Well, I just have one response, and maybe it's a little bit of a discussion point to Julia. I'm really curious about the administration's response or lack of response to the climate action report that your students made. I'm not sure if Montana State has a climate action plan. I know that many institutions have great plans, many have no plans, and many have something in the middle. Was this something that was done, in some sense collaboratively with your institution? Was it well received, or was it sort of, if you want to do that, that's fine? What was the sort of response?
I'll answer that, Heather, unless you want. I have not generated a synthetic set of comments about everybody's.
Yeah, I wanted to just create space in case there was something that people wanted to respond to, but we can also go to the Q&A. So why don't you go ahead with that, and then I'll open it up to Andrew. If Andrew has anything that they would like to share, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for broader Q&A.
Okay, well, and my general comment would be, you all are so inspiring, and I'm so grateful that you're doing what you're doing, and I'm happy to be here in this community and conversation. And we've sort of at various AAGs, we've always tried to have some of these circles, and I think given this emphasizes for me a point that I was making, which is like the demand greatly outstrips the supply. And so anything that we can do to share in the spirit of mutual aid, we should be doing it. If you have students that want to know about coal in Montana or, rural communities, like, let me give a guest lecture, and sharing even, some of our assignments. I just wish we could up our game in mutual aid in that way. Especially any of you who might be junior faculty in the future, because it's just such a heavy lift, and it's such an important societal kind of issue that there's no reason for us to be, just killing ourselves if there are places where we can leverage each other's resources. So Tom, in answer to your question, where was the administration with respect to our climate action planning initiative? What MSU would like to do, this is being recorded, so I need to think about this, is kind of thread the needle, where we are a nationally known university for engineering and architecture. And so we have the capacity to do tremendous innovation on campus. And we're also an ag school. So we have, since our sustainability office was voted in by the student government and is funded by student fees, and so that it's really student led. Our administration feels very exposed to state politics. And if you follow Montana politics, you might not be surprised to know that we have, a governor and a legislature who are explicitly hostile to higher education. And so one of the things that happens as you transition into a role of, sort of administration, and this is just my personality, you come to see both sides, right? So we have faculty and students who are extremely frustrated by what they see as a lack of overt leadership with respect to adopting very ambitious goals. We have recently adopted a whole set of goals. On the other hand, you have the very real reality that, when our county went forward with this serious mask mandate, the governor responded by cutting all of the CARES Act funding to our county. So that to me is killing people, right? That's an act of genocide that is in response to a political gesture by the county, or a public policy by the county. So the risk is not insignificant, right? That there will be retaliation. So I'm very sympathetic to our president and leaders who want to thread the needle, which is to say, how can we get innovation that will help us have a smaller climate footprint? How can we inspire students without being too public about it? And so just in direct answer to your question, I'd say that's the level at which they're supportive. And we did adopt a new climate neutrality target, which we hadn't had before. We have a great sustainability plan. I'll put it in the website. And then we're in the process of a participatory climate action plan. And what's exciting about that report, and I do encourage you to look at, is it sort of lays out a template for what do you need to be successful in doing a climate action plan. In our case, like with a lens on, we're not Berkeley, right? We're not the Cal system. We're in a different set of politics. And when the students give this presentation, like to our University Planning Council or to the president, they have a slide of the president that they start with, and they say, if you don't have support from leadership, you won't be successful. So they've become, I mean, the biggest success is that these folks have become, students have become really savvy. And this was my goal, was to translate them from being like, they should always be sign carrying activists about climate change, but they are going to have to work in situations where that's not enough. And so to gain some idea about the kind of the nuances and the subtleties of like, how do you get good buildings built on campus, even if your president doesn't want to adopt a climate neutrality target? And by the way, we have an amazing set of new LEED certified platinum buildings. We have so much ingenuity. You know, one of the things I do is introduce them to all the guys on facilities who are like designing these buildings. And that's about that mutual understanding and tolerance and like kindness and respect for the people working on campus. And it really changes, I think, fundamentally, like changes these students' lives and outlook. So I'm excited about it. I hope that wasn't too much.
That was great. Thank you.
And just to echo before I pass it off to Andrew, and you don't have to have anything, Andrew, but I agree with you, Julia, that any way that we can support each other. And again, I will re-emphasize this, kind of when I first started teaching, I wanted to do everything. And I feel like sometimes you can stretch yourself too thin. And so because we've all offered to share resources, if folks want them, I think feel free to follow up. I think as the energy and environment group, we've talked about having some sort of repository of resources, maybe not publicly available, but for members as well. I don't know where we're at with that at this point, but I think, you know, we started these conversations a couple years ago, and it's just really reinvigorating every time I learn from all of you. So again, ask for resources if you want them until we get to that point. So Andrew, is there anything that you wanted to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to comment to say, what's useful about sessions like these are the practical tools that you get from them. And so for me, as like a new faculty member, right, somebody who's learning how to teach my classes, you know, hearing the experiences from the other panelists and the projects that have been envisioned, the ways in which you make the ideas that you're teaching, like practical assignments and things that people do over the course of a semester, all of these are cool learning tools. And, you know, I'm like, gives me ideas in teaching. So that's just my comment, is I feel like that's what's really kind of nice and useful about these, is to hear what other people are doing and get a sense of what works. And, you know, other people in this room, this virtual room, it would be also great for me, you know, I'd also benefit to hear other examples too. So anyway, that's all I have to say.
So I guess I would respond by saying, you know, the Energy and Environment Specialty Group of the AAG, of which this session is sponsored by, and many of us are members, have, as Heather mentioned, you know, been trying to develop more resources around pedagogy. I remember, I think it was the AAG in Chicago many years ago, we started having these informal sessions at which Julia and others were there. And it's still sort of on the periphery. We have a space on the eesg.org website for resources, and I think we might have 2 syllabi. And that's about as far as it gets. I think it's a good start. I think we can do a lot more. And I think that, you know, if there's one thing that we learn, and especially what you've just said, Andrew, is we don't really understand all of the things that the innovative ways that people are, you know, approaching energy geography pedagogy until we get into these type of environments. So hopefully, you know, now we can be a bit more strategic about in terms of what we might be able to offer folks that are teaching energy geographies. And the aspirational goal for the EESG is to be seen as a resource. And whether that's, you know, at a very sort of simple level, having syllabi on the website, or maybe having some sort of portal that, you know, folks can go to that are members, or just knowing here are people that, you know, other EESG members can reach out to for these, you know, if you, if you're about to start teaching a class, or you're teaching a class, or you're doing something else, here are the people that might be able to sort of share resources or point you in the right direction. That's the aspirational goal. I think we're moving in the right direction, and I'm excited to see us sort of continue to build this momentum.
Yeah, and just to give a little plug for that, because I'm part of another initiative where we've been held up for like 2 years doing a repository because people want something really fancy. Like, I would just go really low tech and just keep it really basic. And, you know, I'm happy to share syllabi, but I can't remember when that call went out. So I think, you know, even if it's a fresh email to folks to say, do you have reports that you want to share? Because Julia and I both just shared publicly available reports. And then just having a really basic spreadsheet, and even if it's like not super well organized, but people know there's some resources there, or like even, you know, the fact that Julie and I both use the Bridget All textbook, you know, those kind of little things are really helpful. And then more broadly, like Andrew, I don't know if you use it but I use the Environment Society textbook when I teach that class. So those kind of little things, that some of them are very energy specific, some are a bit broad, but I would keep it as simple as possible, because this other initiative I've been part of, it really has bogged it down. So Edgar, I want to open it up to you, because I know you had a question for Tom, and then Andrew, if you want to share those maps at some point too during the Q&A. And then I think there's a question from Julia to Adam, and then, or maybe you're going back and forth there. So Edgar, did you want to share your question?
Thank you, Heather. So I think that actually Thomas answered my question during his presentation, but it's fine. I have an important question. I think that for all of you, first, I want to thank you for investing the time sharing all the resources. I think it's pretty valuable, especially for young faculty and early career scholars who are just starting and feel motivated by this. So thank you. And I'm really curious to learn a little bit more about the assessment part, because I have heard wonderful things about how, and I'm impressed by how devoted you are to developing all these resources. And I'm sure that even if we estimate that they take certain amount of time, they can take 2 or 3 times the time that I'm estimating. But I'm also trying to identify, how do you assess if the students are actually getting the knowledge that you are expecting, especially since we are speaking about community engaged. Sometimes I found that there is some complexity on understanding if we are actually delivering what the students get to that point. And I'll just mention something before the question, is that I'm always curious about if these kind of active learning activities like the one that Thomas mentioned and help the students to open their perspective a little bit, because what I have found is that sometimes if you are in renewable lover or the fossil fuel or nuclear, or you have any technology that you feel really passionate about, and many of these activities actually help you to focus on like to put more strength on the first idea that you have, rather than opening your mind to a more balanced and nuanced approach. So I'm just happy to listen to any comment that you can have about the assessment and how that impacts the perspective of the students.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly here. You know, assessment around this stuff is always based around learning, like, and it's, you know, up to the students to demonstrate or communicate through their writing in the research paper what they learned through the process. And we do that in the reflection exercise at the end. We reflect on what they learned coming in at the start, and, you know, how they may have changed thinking, or how at the end of it, you know, they're more confused than what they started. And that's what I tell the students. If I'm doing my job, you know, effectively, you should have more questions at the end than you had at the start, which really confuses them. About this point with people advocating for specific technologies, I'm really intentional about this, and it's not always perfect, but what I tend to do is I take the students that I, you know, are clearly, you know, I don't want to say more environmentally focused, but many of them are, and I make them advocate for oil, and I put them in the oil and the gas and the coal groups, and they tell me, we absolutely hate you, Tom, because this was the hardest thing that we've ever had to do, and that you can see them up there in front of the class as their faces are red. And after they've got through the emotion of having to take this really difficult position on something they are ethically and morally opposed to, later when they reflect on it, they think, you know, they've commonly communicated, that was so hard, but I learned, you know, I saw a more nuanced side to this. This is really complex. So we've had some pretty good results there.
Yeah, and just to back that up, I do a lot of debates, not just in my energy classes, but for that exact reason. And it's so hard for them. But I think anytime they have to go into a different stakeholder role or kind of think through those other positions, I think it does help them to get out of those boxes, even if they're not very popular at the moment. So, okay, other questions? Feel free to just go ahead and speak if anyone has a question or idea or something that you use you want to share. And that's a great resource, Julia, that you just shared.
And while people are coming up with their questions, I'll just respond to Edgar as well, just to say that, yeah, I'm never as good at assessment as I am at designing assignments. And I'm never as enthusiastic about it as I am about designing assignments. And I never do as good of a job as I wish I had done. So it's really hard. And that's just about, I mean, you guys can probably hear in my voice, like I'm weary. I feel I'm like really overworked and burned out, and assessment is part of that. I do design, so I talked about this competency-based approach. And so using things like papers and research papers to demonstrate your critical thinking skills and your application of kind of some of our social theory, then using the homework to develop competency about mapping energy, political relations, you know, competencies just in reading EIA data and what are the units and metrics and stuff. And that I can test in tests that have the ability to be auto graded. So I have, you know, short competency kind of quizzes or pieces in my midterms that allow the students to demonstrate for themselves that I did actually learn how to do this and don't have a huge assessment component for me.
Yeah, and just to add on there with the assessment, it's also not my favorite piece of the puzzle. But particularly when I'm teaching those civic engagement classes, like I do have them do what Tom was suggesting, that I have them reflect back on what they learned from the methods in relation to the theories and kind of how it dispels or kind of disrupts some of those ideas. But I also have them do like a broad civic engagement reflection, which the first time I did it, I was like, this doesn't feel very specific. It doesn't feel very grounded, but it allows them to reflect on where they see their community and what role they see themselves playing in it. And I really we have a wonderful person who leads our civic engagement on campus, and he's really pushed for this. Like, we don't really need like traditional assessments for civic engagement classes. It's a different kind of learning, and it really encourages the students to see themselves as part of a community. And so I try to kind of thread that needle of having the theory and having the application, but then also just encouraging them to figure out, whether it's here or elsewhere, like who is their community, how do they want to engage, and how do they support that. And it's been really liberating for me to kind of not feel like it has to be like a traditional form of assessment, but that I have that space and that flexibility.
Can I chime in with that question? Thank you for continuing these sessions. I think I've attended them all since Chicago, so I'm really glad that the momentum has been sustained. This has been really exciting today. I'm wondering how folks try to immerse students in energy landscapes, if at all, like if you do any sort of field trips. And I'm sorry for a little shameless plug. One thing that we've done here at Penn State, this is before COVID and then through COVID, we've been using VR technology, so like immersive virtual field trips, and we have some trips to shale and solar developments throughout Pennsylvania, and we've been piloting them in my class. And I think that it's like just kind of piggybacking on like what Heather's last comment was, you know, we're geographers and we're critical geographers, so like we know that like a map or a visualization is important for what it includes and excludes. But what I want to try to do with this is do these field trips and not have any commentary with them, and then just ask people what they see so that we can kind of get at like the place attachments. And then perhaps I'm a little naive, but I'm wondering if by bringing people virtually into these spaces, if that can also be a means of policy engagement. So, you know, what do people, you know, again, like just bringing to the table, what do people see by looking at these places? But I don't know, I'm open to suggestions. I'm also just want to know what people do, if anything, in terms of field trips.
I can say that I have had to pivot a little bit for two reasons. I mean, obviously COVID, but forever we would go out to our big mine mouth coal power plant. And so the one thing that makes me nervous about VR, I love all the potential that you describe, right? But I do think the single biggest learning moment most of my students have, especially those who might be, you know, really terrified of coal, and rightly so, you know, that they meet the engineers at the mine who genuinely like really want to reclaim they are individuals, they're human beings with families. They are, they take their profession very seriously, and like cumulatively, do they add up to an industry that has a huge amount of injustices and horrible things associated with it? Yes, but they're also neighbors and parents and trying to do good things. And that the students like being in the truck with them and seeing them and eating lunch with them, like there is to me no single like more valuable thing. It's been extremely, so we can't really go there anymore because politics are such that it just became too painful really for the community to host us. We can go to other places. So we go to wind farms. And again, it's like, who is the farmer that, you know, decided there was going to be a wind farm here? And what was it like for him to negotiate with Iberdrola and all that? Like that is for me, like being in the landscape, being out of the classroom, it's those interactions that are so valuable. And it's a nice thing about, you know, for all of us who are at land grants, like it's pretty easy for us to drum up those community connections. But again, it's an interesting thing to, and I will plug for Mike Pascoletti's book, like he has a really nice chapter in there on this field trip that he's done forever in Arizona. And yeah, and again, it's also hard. It's really hard for my students to get away. Most of them work at least 2 jobs. So we're asking them to take time off work to go on a field trip. We don't pay them for those last hours. And I do see like an emerging differential at Montana State between students that come from out of state with full tuition paid for and what they're able to do like in the sustainability space, and those who are disadvantaged by needing to work their way through college and like not being able to take it. They would not be on my sustainability independent directed study project. Like they just don't have the resources to do that. So I think we want to be really careful of that. And maybe the VR thing is part of that. And of course, bringing people to campus, and we just need to make noise about it too, and just make sure we're paying attention to it.
Yeah, I would just second that. I used to take the students to some of the dams on the Snake River. Actually, what we would do, we would start with the campus steam plant, just a local energy system, go to a wind farm and go to the dams. And we would sort of finish when I was in Idaho by taking them to the Hanford nuclear site, which was fantastic. But with COVID and, you know, a lot of that relies on developing relationships in all of those folks that are willing to take you in. And just with COVID, I haven't been able to do that yet. But I would second what Julia said, that the transformative moments that the students have had on those field trips, I've seen them myself. And it's where everything that you talk about in the, I guess, abstract is just, you know, standing on the, you know, a giant turbine at a dam and everyone's vibrating and it's making this noise and it's spinning around and going to the spillway and, you know, there's huge volumes of water are just cascading out. It's where you start to see the cogs really turn from, you know, this is stuff that we talk about in class and these are the people that are out here sort of doing this. So yeah, I'm excited to find ways to do that down here in Texas as well.
Yeah, and I would like to echo Julia's request. If those VR tools, I don't know if they're available publicly, but I would love them too, because I've had to stop field trips with COVID. I'm thinking about Harrisburg for the fall, just starting local, for some policy things. But Andrew, I realize you didn't get a chance to respond and we're at time. So I want to give you a chance if you have a response to that or something else that you wanted to share related to the maps, and then we'll close out.
Yeah, I don't do field trips yet because of the COVID situation, but it's really cool to hear the idea of VR. That's something I hadn't thought about. I guess the closest equivalent is to find good documentaries. Those are like visual tools that people can use. And there's a number of them that focus on stuff in the Navajo Nation that I try to utilize. So that might be another repository of resources we can add to the website that I was looking at just a moment ago with was like good documentaries that kind of focus on some of these things in case you can't take people out somewhere, you can actually, show it visually that way. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you all. And I'm teaching for the first time a just energy transition class, like as a standalone. So if anyone has any ideas, I'm teaching it next spring. So I'm excited and gathering a lot of resources. But thank you all for spending time with us on a Saturday, and stay healthy and safe. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Great
Bye-bye.
to see everyone. Thanks so much, Heather and Tom, for organizing.
No problem. For presenting.